Record. Is it recording? Okay, this is pauses.
Yeah, go ahead, sit down.
So I'm going to broadcast right now.
Do you need to sit down?
No,
Do it on.
I'm gonna, okay, so the webinar is broadcasting now, so people are going to start joining.
Okay. Do you want to come and tell me when you want me to start, or should I just start it?
You should just start it.
Okay.
Yeah, we're gonna try and figure that out.
Okay. Sounds good. Hello. On behalf of Dr. Deidre Buchwald, Director of the Initiative for Research and Education to Advance Community Health, I would like to welcome you to the Native Chart Hypertension webinar series. My name is Cindy Gamble. I'm Tlingit and a tribal liaison with Partnerships for Native Health at Washington State University. We are so glad that you joined us today. Here is our agenda for the day. First, we will tell you a little bit about us and the Native Chart Project. Then Dr. Kahola Kula will present on the effects of racism on hypertension in Native Hawaiians. We will have 10 minutes for question and answer at the conclusion of Dr. Kahola Kula's talk. We want to share with you that Zoom has raise your hand and question and answer features for you to use. However, all questions will be addressed in the Q&A time slot at the end. At that time, we will unmute those who have raised their hand so that you can ask your question directly of Dr. Kahola Kula, and we will also read the questions in the Q&A chat box. Also, within 24 hours of this webinar, we will be sending you a link for an evaluation survey. We hope that you will help us to learn from this experience and participate in the survey. All participants will be entered into a drawing to win a $30 Tango gift card. Sorry about that. We are Partnerships for Native Health, and we are housed in the Initiative for Research and Education to Advance Community Health, or IREACH, at Washington State University. Partnerships for Native Health was formed due to an interest in American Indian and Alaska Native health and research, and the clear need for information and data on health status and the social determinants of health that contribute to the challenges faced by our populations. Our model of partnering with tribes and tribal communities on projects of interest and importance to them has proven to be successful. We have now expanded our model of conducting community-focused research to other populations who are experiencing health disparities and are not involved in the needed research to help address the disparities. We started out with a focus on American Indian and Alaska Natives that has now expanded to include Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders and other indigenous populations. We work with both rural and urban populations with all ages across the lifespan. We have over 160 partners, which includes tribes and urban Indian health programs, tribal colleges, universities, and now Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander health and community organizations. Our center works on issues and topics that are important to the populations that we serve. Examples of some of these important issues are alcohol dependence, substance abuse prevention, diabetes, stroke risk reduction, cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease, and of course, high blood pressure. The Native Controlling Hypertension and Risk Through Technology, or Native Chart, aims to improve blood pressure control and cardiovascular disease risk factors for American Indian, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders with diagnosed high blood pressure. Native Chart has 3 intervention projects and 4 supporting cores, which are the Administrative Core, the Dissemination Core, the Methodology Core, and the Consortium Core. Within the Consortium Core are 7 satellite centers which work to expand the network of community partners by hosting annual conferences and conducting annual assessments at the local level. This map shows that this project is working across the nation from Alaska to North Carolina, and also shows the project leads and principal investigators of each center. Here are the 3 projects. First, the Chickasaw Healthy Eating Environments Research Study, or CHEERS. CHEERS focuses on healthy eating and exercise practices which are tribally developed and implemented. The Blood Pressure Improving Control Among Alaska Native People, or BPICAN, will support their customer owner participants to know their blood pressure numbers through providing home monitoring equipment and encouraging heart-healthy life choices, including communicating with their healthcare providers. Engaging Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders and activating communities to take steps, or enacts, also emphasizes heart healthy choices of traditional Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander food and activities. There is also additional support for food purchase and tracking physical activity. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Keawe Kaholakula. Dr. Kaholakula is Professor and Chair of Native Hawaiian Health in the John A. Burns School of Medicine at the University of Hawaii at Manoa and a licensed clinical psychologist. His research involves developing community-based and culturally relevant health promotion programs to address diabetes and cardiovascular disease inequities in Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders using community-based participatory research approaches. His research also examines how biological, psychosocial, and sociocultural factors interplay to affect the risk for and management of chronic diseases. His work has had an impact on the local, regional, and national levels to bring systemic improvements to healthcare delivery, clinical outcomes, and policy through community-based research efforts. He has strong commitments to achieving health equity and improving the health of Indigenous communities, which are reflected in his services on the national level as past chair for the Intervention Research to Improve Native American Health Network and his recent appointment to the National Advisory Council on Minority Health and Health Disparities. On a local level, he serves on boards of organizations with a mission to improve population and Native Hawaiian health, to include the Queen's Health Systems, Hawaii Public Health Institute, and Papaola Lokahi Native Hawaiian Health Board. As a Native Hawaiian, he is passionate about improving the health of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders and has made a lifelong commitment to improving their social and cultural determinants of health. And now, Dr. Kaholakula.
Mahalo nui for that introduction. Vilina mekela ia kākou. Good afternoon, I think, for most people, and good morning to those from Hawaii on the webinar. And also mahalo to everyone, faculty and staff of NatiChart, for the invite to speak today and talk about racism and hypertension in Native Hawaiians. Please give me a second to get my slides up. There you go. So I just want to first start off by sharing with you who are Native Hawaiians, for those that may not be as familiar as others. So Native Hawaiians, or Kanaka Oiwi, are the descendants of the original inhabitants of the people residing in Hawaii prior to 1778, the year that Captain James Cook actually haphazardly came upon these islands looking for a Northwest Passage. And Native Hawaiians make up a majority of those classified by OMB as Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders. And you can see on the screen here, we make up about 43%, with a majority, of course, living in Hawaii, followed by California and Washington State. When we look here in Hawaii and the ethnic distribution, we find that Native Hawaiians actually, for a state that has no real majority, makes up a significant number of the population at 23%, approaching 25% now. And despite, we also are very, our ethnic admixture, we intermarry pretty readily, have been since the 1800s. Therefore, Hawaiians have multiple ethnic ancestries often. Despite all of that, through our research over the years, we found that 90% of Hawaiians, actually 93% of Hawaiians, identify very strongly of their Hawaiian ancestry and heritage, and choose their Hawaiian ethnic identity as their primary identity, despite their ethnic admixture.
Keawe, excuse me, could you put your presentation on presentation mode, because we can see duplicate slides here.
You see duplicate slides, okay. How do I do that? Is that it? Nope.
No.
Let me, shucks. I'm not sure how to do that. So you see two the same slide?
Yeah, so right now we see your notes and we can see the upcoming slide. Okay, so do swap presenter and slideshow. Click that.
So there you go. How's that?
See, hold on one second. Can you try choosing duplicate slideshow or duplicate slideshow?
Okay, that would be under display settings.
Mm-hmm.
How's that?
Let's see. Okay, so go towards the bottom and share your screen again. Because right now okay. Okay, there you go. That's
Is
it.
it better? Oh, okay.
Got it.
All right. Sorry about that. And in Native Hawaiians, coming back to demographics, Native Hawaiians are expected to double in population size by 2050, approaching 1 million Native Hawaiians. So it's really good news for our population. I think it's similar for most indigenous populations as we recover from the infectious diseases that nearly wiped out our populations in the 1800s. And now that we are challenged not by infectious diseases, but with chronic diseases, it's really good news. However, the concern is here that, if we don't get a handle on these health disparities that are affecting our communities, unfortunately, it's just more people that will get disease and die younger because of it in our communities. So we really need to get a handle on this. And one of the things that we've been doing, okay, how do I advance now? Anyone there? Doesn't seem to be.
Press forward, the forward arrow,
Yeah, it's
clicking your mouse.
not doing that. There we go. Okay. Did I do that, or did someone there do that?
You did it.
All right. Okay. So kind of give you an idea of hypertension in Native Hawaiians. It's, as you know, it's a major risk factor for coronary heart disease and stroke. Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders compared to whites are 70% more likely to develop hypertension, less likely to receive adequate hypertension care, and they're 3 to 4 times more likely to develop heart disease and stroke. And we get these diseases a decade sooner than other populations. And just to give you an idea of the severity of hypertension, it accounts for nearly 50% of all ischemic strokes. And this is one of the earlier studies that you see on your screen that we've done here in Hawaii. It actually came out of the Native Hawaiian Health Research Project on the island of Hawaii, also known as the Big Island. And way back when, we wanted to look at Andrew Grandinetti and our team wanted to look at the relationship between blood pressure and degree of Hawaiian ancestry. As I mentioned earlier, Hawaiians, for the most part, are multi-ethnic. However, we do have Hawaiians with 100% ancestry. And we wanted to look at whether there were differences in regards to Hawaiian ancestry and hypertension prevalence. And as you can see from the screen, there was a relationship, a positive correlation or association between having hypertension and degree of Hawaiian ancestry, with higher degree of Hawaiian ancestry actually having higher risk for hypertension. And after adjusting for a number of variables to include age, gender, and BMI, it persisted. And after further adjusting for education level, depression symptoms, physical activity levels, waist-hip ratio, markers of insulin resistance, and even Hawaiian lifestyle scores or Hawaiian identity scores, there remain a significant association mainly between diastolic blood pressure and Hawaiian ancestry. And one of the conclusions we made way back then about some of the reasons perhaps for this, of course, aside from genetic and environmental interactions that we hypothesized may be affecting, one of the things we really strongly suggested was that what we're seeing may be actually related to discrimination or perceived racism experienced by Native Hawaiians. You can imagine as you increase in your degree of Hawaiian ancestry, your phenotype, skin color, for example, also darkens. And this may be, and those things may be a marker for the experience of racism or discrimination. Another study that early on influenced me in looking at the relationship between racism and hypertension actually came out of a study looking at diabetes. Very early on, I was interested in this theory of acculturation by Barry Kim and, John Barry and Ucho Kim out of Canada. They were cross-cultural psychologists, and back in the late 80s, early 90s, they were doing some work around looking at acculturation modes or acculturation strategies, and they suggested that, or proposed that there were four modes that people could settle in: immigrants, native folks, refugees, for example, in response to a new environmental situation in a new country. And over time, of course, acculturation is a process, but over time, they would have to eventually settle on some mode or strategy to dealing with these changes and the new situation and the new cultural group. And they could become integrated or bicultural. They could, what they called separatist or traditional. So integrated is they highly identify with their traditional ethnoculture, continue to affiliate and interact and identify. The other is they also, to the same degree, do so with the mainstream culture. The traditional, what they originally termed as separatists, highly identifies with their ethnoculture, and for whatever reason, don't highly identify with the mainstream. Assimilated is they don't, for whatever reason, don't choose to highly identify or continue their ethnic cultural affiliations, but have assimilated into the mainstream and marginalized on low on both ends. And I was interested in this because I was really interested in within group differences in risk for disease. Often we look across cultural groups or ethnic groups at these, and that can be helpful, but it's also important to know that not all Native Hawaiians, not all Indigenous people have diabetes or heart disease. And I was curious to know what are some within group differences that might explain diabetes risk in this case. And as you can see, counter to our hypothesis, the traditional group had two times more diabetes than the integrated group. The overall prevalence of diabetes for this entire sample of 495 Native Hawaiians is 19%, to give you an idea of how high the diabetes risk is for the traditional group. And we controlled for a number of factors: age, education level, body mass index, Hawaiian ancestry, because Hawaiians are mixed racially, triglycerides as a poor marker of diet, and fasting insulin. Even after controlling for everything, there still remain a significant association between acculturation strategy and diabetes, mainly with the traditional group having the most highest risk. Now, mind you, this is not self-report diabetes. These are confirmed diabetes. And what we initially hypothesized was that the integrated group would actually do better. They would have the best of two worlds. But to our surprise, the traditional group the traditional group, we originally hypothesized that they would be the best because they had a strong Hawaiian identity. But it was the integrated group that came out to be better. And the assimilated and marginalized is really difficult to make any conclusions about these two groups because they're really small ends. A majority, as you can see, are integrated, with the next highest being traditional at 17%. So what this suggested, well, there's something going on among those who highly identify, especially exclusively identifies with their ethnic heritage. And one of the things we hypothesized, because of course this is simply a marker for something else. They have every right to identify as such, but however, the context in which their identity is operating may be challenging. And what we hypothesized were that Native Hawaiians, perhaps, who are traditional, are being met with some resistance from the mainstream in doing so, and maybe within families as well, causing some stressors, some chronic stressors, that may be putting them at risk for chronic disease. And this really led us to begin to look at the issue of racism and move away from the acculturation status. And early on, we hypothesized that maybe it's racism, that those who highly identify with being Hawaiian are also experiencing more discrimination and challenges in being Hawaiian in their homeland. So as you know, racism is the beliefs, acts, and institutional measures that devalue people because of their phenotype or ethnic affiliations. It's also called racial discrimination or ethnic discrimination or racial ethnic oppression. Within many ethnic groups across the United States, interpersonal and internalized racism has been found associated with higher risk for many mental and physical health problems. Racism is a social stressor that is believed to threaten the physical health of of our ethnic minority groups. It has been found to be associated with depression, anxiety, and substance use, adverse birth outcomes, hypertension, obesity, and cardiovascular disease, to name a few. And when we began looking at racism in Native Hawaiians, I was actually very surprised about, in regards to the number of Native Hawaiians that were reporting discrimination frequently. So over the past 12 months, our research found that 48% of Native Hawaiians report being discriminated against often to most of the time, while the other 52% reported being discriminated against sometimes. None of the Hawaiians reported being discriminated against none of the time over a 12-month period. It was all on the higher end of the scale. And when we first looked at it, we really didn't have any funding for this kind of research, but we had very enthusiastic medical students that really assisted. Marcus Iwane was one of them that wanted to look further at the issue of racism and hypertension. And we were able to do some convenient sampling of 94 adult Native Hawaiians. This is based on self-report. And what we found was in this very small study that there was a strong association between reports of discrimination and having hypertension. So the OQ scores there in the red box, the bottom, the very top of the red box, is the oppression questionnaire. Now, we were challenged in finding a racism questionnaire that fit the circumstances and context for Native Hawaiians. Most of the ethnic discrimination measures out there have been developed mainly for African Americans, and they've had a quite different experience than our Native Hawaiians. We were able to find one that was general enough that it would capture the experiences of Native Hawaiians, and that was the oppression questionnaire. And the HCSS there is the Hawaiian Cultural Identity Scale. It's the same one we used in the previous study of diabetes that I had shared with you. And the bottom there, the ACSS, is the American Cultural Subscale. And what we found was there was a strong association between reports of discrimination and having hypertension. And when we controlled for this in a logistic regression model, and we controlled for the other characteristics you see there, the relationship between the OQ scores and hypertension remained, as well as the American cultural identity actually was an independent predictor of hypertension, independent of the OQ scores or the racism scores, which is really interesting. And it was in a positive direction. So the stronger they're affiliated with the American culture, the more likely they were to report having hypertension. So of course, we were curious about that. What we hypothesized was that it may be another a marker of discrimination for Native Hawaiians who are wanting the American dream, but are challenged by it. Either not being accepted by the mainstream, but wanting to be, and maybe also within their families because of their higher affiliation towards the mainstream over their Hawaiian identity. But it was very interesting results. And we were curious to go further and really look at the issue of racism and the effects on the health of Native Hawaiians. So we're able to get some monies through an NIH grant, an infrastructure grant actually, and begin looking at this again on the Big Island of Hawaii. And this time we collected data. So we were interested in looking at the effects of racism on physiological indices of stress. And the two indices of stress that we looked at were cortisol and blood pressure. And what I'm showing here on the screen right now is the hierarchical regression model looking at the OQ scores again. This time we broke it up into, there's two subscales, attributed racism subscale and felt racism subscale. We did a factor analysis to confirm that indeed we had two distinct subscales here for this study, and we went ahead and looked at them separately. And what we found was that the attributed is really different. The attributed there's a group out there that is discriminating against us as a group, whereas felt racism is really the individual feeling that they are discriminated against, not just in general terms as being a member of being Native, the Native Hawaiian group, but really being discriminated against. And so it was interesting. We found a significant negative association between the racism scores and cortisol, and this was measured through saliva. We took two samples, AM and PM, and this is diurnal cortisol output based on that. And we adjusted for a series of things, social demographics, as you can see in Model 1. We added the clinical measures in Model 2 and then the psychosocial measures in Model 3. As you can see, the coefficient regression there was pretty robust right through the adjustments that were made and continued to have a significant negative correlation with cortisol. And was it really interesting. I know many people are probably thinking, well, usually cortisol goes up in response to a stressor. That's with acute stress. But studies have shown, both with humans and animals, that with chronic stressors, that there can actually be a flattening or a blunting of the cortisol response over time. The body can't stay revved up for so long. It has to somehow adjust. Homeostasis, allostatic load has been looked at, for example. We see this kind of cortisol activity in persons with PTSD, for example, also with depression, for long-term depression, and victims of domestic violence and caregivers of ill family members. And also in other studies, lower cortisol levels has been associated with the psychological construct of learned helplessness. So that was a real interesting finding for us. And in regards to blood pressure, what we found was that there was a significant positive correlation between blood pressure and the racism scores, particularly the felt discrimination subscale of the measure. However, after adjusting, mainly for BMI, that association kind of washed away. However, it is important to note that there have been studies looking at Native Hawaiians and obesity and found that that racism is associated with obesity in Native Hawaiians. So this, again, may be another marker of discrimination in a different way. So one of my colleagues, Dr. Andrea Homosura, who was also my postdoc, she just recently completed her postdoc with us here in the department. For her dissertation, she did an experimental study looking at cardiovascular reactivity and recovery among Native Hawaiians in response to racist stimuli. And she did a number of things. First of all, she created the stimuli because we didn't have any vignettes. With Native Hawaiian experts in Native Hawaiian culture, Native Hawaiian stakeholders from the Native Hawaiian community, came up with both what we thought were subtle and blatant racist interactions. And she was interested now in looking at that in response, again, to cardiovascular reactivity and recovery. Studies have shown that an exaggerated cardiovascular response to or impaired recovery following stressful events are risk factors for hypertension and cardiovascular disease and predictive of cardiovascular disease morbidity and mortality. So she examined the reactivity and recovery in 35 Native Hawaiian college students to both the subtle and blatant. And what she did prior to conducting the experiment was, at baseline, identify those who reported a lot of discrimination in general and those who did not. And to make sure that we could, the idea here was that those who experience a lot of racism and report that may pick up even on the subtle exposure to a racist interaction, whereas those who do not report that much discrimination would probably not respond to the subtle in the same way. So what she did was take their blood pressures, their heart rate, and so forth, and began the experiment. And what we found was that systolic blood pressure recovery following exposure to both the subtle and blatant stressors was significant for both groups. Albeit non-significant, there were trends in the high perceived racism group, and this was observed in several areas. One was greater reactivity to the subtle, as we had thought. The other was incomplete heart rate recovery after exposure to both stressors, and partial systolic and diastolic blood pressure recovery following exposure to the subtle stressors. Overall, the participants reported also subjective distress following the blatant stressor exposure compared to that of the subtle. And what's interesting, if you look at studies with other ethnic groups, especially African Americans, what we're finding now is that the subtle type of racism can be much more damaging than the blatant racism. You can imagine that for subtle racism, it takes a lot of effort to figure out why you feel you're being treated such a way. Is it because of your race? Is it because of your gender? Is it something else? Whereas with blatant racism, it's unfortunate, but at least you can call it for what it is, maybe deal with it in a more effective fashion, and move on. For example, I go to a restaurant, it's very clear I'm being discriminated against as a Native Hawaiian. I can choose not to go there again. I can put in a complaint to the manager. I can let people know. I can go on Facebook. With subtle racism, it's a little different. It's a bit challenging. It wears on you. A lot of cognitive energy, and perhaps that's why we're seeing a longer recovery period back to baseline. Now, Parodies have published some work looking at the literature across different countries in regards to racism and physical and mental health outcomes. Ignore the bolded boxes and arrows here. This was for another type of presentation. But what you can see is that there's these pathways from racism to health inequities that I want to highlight. And one path is really through psychological stress that leads to more severe psychological symptoms, coupled with negative coping strategies and physiological stress responses. And as I presented earlier with the previous study by Hermosura. So we've also conducted studies looking at racism and depression symptoms, for example. Antonia et al., another former student of ours, actually just got her first appointment on a tenure track, assistant professor with our Department of Public Health, examined the relationship between discrimination and depression in 104 Native Hawaiians residing on the Hawaiian homestead communities, similar to reservations, but not quite. Very unique population. They're all 50% or greater Native Hawaiian ancestry. This offered us an opportunity to look at this in this kind of community versus the broader Hawaiian community. What we found was a significant positive correlation between perceived discrimination, depression symptoms after adjusting for what you see there on the screen. One thing interesting about this is that we didn't find, in the past studies that I presented, we find a very high correlation, positive correlation between Hawaiian cultural identity and perceived discrimination. In this study, we didn't quite find that. The sample size may have been too small to detect significance there. Or it could be due to other characteristics that are very unique to Hawaiian homestead communities. Now, all these people that live in these communities are Native Hawaiian, highly identified being Native Hawaiian, and that could serve as a buffer against some of these discriminations that other Native Hawaiians are probably experiencing in more multi-ethnic communities that they reside in. We did another study looking at a structural equation model, looking at coping strategies. As you recall, with Parodies pathways, one of the things that he believes it may be a mediator in these relationships is the coping strategies by people use to deal with the stress of racism. And what we found, and we looked at 14 distinct coping strategies that are proposed by Carver et al. And 7 are considered positive coping strategies, negative that are considered negative coping strategies. And what we found were that these two, venting and behavioral disengagement, significantly mediated the relationship between racism and psychological distress. And that was an indirect pathway. There was no direct association, but there was a strong indirect association, as you can see from the screen, from perceived racism to psychological distress. And venting, as you can imagine, is pretty much anger expression, which has been found in other ethnic groups to also be a mediator between racism and other measures of psychological distress in African Americans, for example. Behavioral disengagement can be likened to learned helplessness. You just don't do anything to deal with the situation. You just go on, but it may actually weigh on a person over time and do cause some psychological distress, as indicated here. So I want to turn my attention, though, to something positive. So far, I've shown you some of the studies that have been done here in Hawaii looking at the relationship between racism and hypertension in particular, both experimental studies as well as observational studies. But what I want to turn my attention to in the last 10 minutes, I believe, of my presentation is really an intervention study that we're currently doing. What I'm going to present to you is actually the pilot, or the pilot study that we did. And it's called, the intervention itself is called Oloho Ika Hula, Reviving Health Through Hula is the interpretation. And as you can see on the screen there on the left, in the middle, strumming the ukulele is Kumuhula Mapwana de Silva. She is part of our investigative team on the project, as well as our lead Kumu that actually designed the intervention that we're using. And on the right there is Melee Look, who is also one of our investigators and the instigator, in a good way, for us to begin this journey in looking at our cultural practice as a health promotion strategy. And I'm going to come back to why and its relationship to hypertension in a moment. What I want to do is share with you a bit about the journey with Kaholo And I know a few of our community members are actually on the webinar right now. So hula, we believe, is a physical activity, and studies have shown that physical activity helps to prevent and treat hypertension. There have been, you can see on the screen here, so for the sake of time, I won't go over it other than saying it has been shown to be effective, especially when coupled with sodium reduction, weight loss, and pharmacological interventions. So hula is really a cultural grounded versus a cultural adapted approach. As you're familiar, cultural adaptation is taking an evidence-based approach that has been found to be efficacious in another population and modifying it for the cultural context of a new population. But cultural grounded is really different. It's really working from the ground up. Looking at the intervention, the core curriculum really is a cultural values, practice, and preferred modes of living. Our studies have shown that Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders, as most indigenous folks, prefer indigenous approaches to health promotion that consider their spiritual and cultural values and that are delivered in more familiar cultural settings. And of course, a tremendous distrust towards Western medicine and Western science in general. Culturally grounded health promotion strategies could have a larger reach and relevance, leading to sustainable behavior changes if we can manage to effectively develop them. And so we looked at hula, our traditional dance of Hawaii. Hula has two components: a traditional hula kahiko, which is a traditional form of hula, and hula awana, a more modern form. Many of you are probably familiar more of the modern form of hula that you have seen on Hawaii Five-0, for example. But there are as a more traditional. The difference is that with modern hula or a hula awana, is usually accompanied by musical instruments such as ukulele, bass, and so forth. Western instruments introduced to Hawaii, whereas hula kahiko is more traditional implements gourds and so forth, or a drum or pahu to dance to. But it's the hallmark of Hawaiian culture, performed to convey historical events, to express our spiritual beliefs and our connections to our natural world and our relationship to each other, similar to perhaps to American Indians, Alaskan Natives. You know, hula is very popular. It appeals to many different groups. It actually, there's more hula halau hula or hula schools outside of Hawaii than there are inside of Hawaii, such as places as Japan, Mexico, and Europe. And it involves using the entire body, the legs, the feet, and so forth, in a rhythmic movement to poetry or songs and chants. And they can be modified to adjust the intensity and duration to accommodate people of different physical capacities. And we went ahead and developed this in collaboration, strong collaboration with the Hawaiian community, led by our Kumuhula Mapuana de Silva. And we went across the state and interviewing different Kumuhula from different hula traditions, as well as other Native Hawaiians who are struggling with heart disease, to get their thoughts. And what we found was, across the board, Hawaiians were just thought it was a great idea to use hula. Hula traditionally has a healing aspect, and so they thought it would have multiple benefits beyond just the physical, to include spiritual, cultural, and emotional. So we went ahead and proceed. And one of the first things we did was we actually looked at the METs, or the metabolic equivalence test of hula, to establish whether or not we could actually get the level of physical activity from hula and control that for an intervention study to standardize. And what we've, and as you know, the MET is a physiological measure expressing the energy cost of physical activities, and is defined as the ratio of metabolic rate. In other words, the rate of energy consumption during a specific physical activity. A METs of 1 would be really at resting. And as you can see, our hula at low intensity was a 6, which is comparable to a general basketball game. And at high intensity, a more formal basketball or volleyball game, and on average at 6.6. So, and we were able to publish this study in the International Journal of Sports Medicine, which really, the first time I believe that a traditional indigenous art form, aside from maybe the Maori haka, might have been looked at in this way. So we felt really good that we had an effective, potentially effective intervention. We went ahead and developed the intervention itself to be a 12 weeks hula lessons, 1 hour each class, 2 times per week. The kumu hula, the hula instructor or master, taught both kahiko, ancient hula, and modern awana. According, and you can see there in the table, There was a very structured, standardized approach to all the classes in which there's a warm-up, a conditioning period, and a cool-down. And we had particular goals, as you can see, in heart rate and so forth, to ensure that they were getting the level of exercise needed to get the full benefit, but also making sure that we can minimize injuries during these hula classes. In addition to the 12 weeks of hula, there was also about 4 hours over the 12 weeks of culturally tailored heart health education, which really was looking at reducing sodium intake, helping them with their medications, understanding their medication, stress management, and so forth. The typical things you would get in a hypertension self-management course that we were able to provide to the participants by community peer educators. And then it was designed entirely to be delivered by Kumu Hula from the community. And Mapuana de Silva was the Kumu Hula who oversaw and trained different hula masters from these communities to build capacity within these communities. And the hula lessons, aside from the physical activity through the dancing of hula, and there's also a lot of cultural and social benefits. It's done in a group. It's actually encouraged that we're one ohana or one family when we are in halau hula. You refer to your hula sisters and brothers, fellow hulas, companions as hula sisters or hula brothers. And we promote basic Hawaiian values of laulima, cooperation, pono, harmony and balance, and again, this sense of extended family and cooperation. And there's much more that we don't have time for, of Hawaiian values that are fostered. It also helps people to connect to the place in which they live, whether they're Hawaiian or not. There's also an opportunity for sharing and interacting with each other, a social support group, if you will. So we conducted a pilot trial, a randomized trial using a waitlist control. We recruited 76 people. About half were Native Hawaiians. The others were actually Chukis, a Micronesian group from a community health center. And they needed to have systolic blood pressure greater than 140 or greater than 130 systolic blood pressure. If they had diabetes, they needed to be under physician care and confirmed by a physician that they have hypertension. And they had to be 21 years of older and independently ambulatory for the exercise component. And then we had a waitlist control. So they were either randomized, and you can see on your left there, the number that were randomized to the intervention, the number to the waitlist control was well-balanced study. It was a pilot study, so that's why the numbers are small. We ran them through the 3-month intervention, or they were in the waitlist control. We took baseline 3-month follow-up. We actually did a 6-month follow-up for the intervention group as well. And what we found was really amazing. We found a greater reduction in systolic blood pressure for the intervention group. And you can see the graph there, the chart on the right, about a 20-point drop in the hula group versus 9 for the control group. And when we looked at the number of those that dropped equal to or more than 10 millimeters of mercury in systolic blood pressure, it was 72% for the intervention group compared to only 39% of the control. And what was more interesting, I think, is that what we found was that what would also improve as a result of going through intervention, as we suspected, is social functioning improved, bodily pain, perhaps because they were getting exercise. But coming back to racism, so I was very interested in racism, so we included the OQ, oppression questionnaire, and we found that for those who underwent the intervention, their perceptions of racism significantly decreased over the 3-month period. No change in the control group at all. And what we believe is happening here is, with a culturally grounded approach to health promotion, in addition to getting these significant clinical outcomes, we also are getting significant social and cultural outcomes. So what we think may be happening is that somehow there's a greater support, or there's a buffering, or even appreciation for their identity in these groups that somehow helps them with the experience of discrimination outside the group. We're not clear on how this is working, but something's going on. So the lessons learned from that study, from the Olohoika Hula program, was that hula benefited not just Native Hawaiians, but other Pacific Islanders equally well. Because we actually we compared between Native Hawaiians and Chukis, and there was no difference in the outcomes. They all equally improved. The social functioning, again, improved. Racism, perceptions of racism improved over time. So some questions that remain for us, what were the long-term benefits of HULA program for hypertension management? And what might be the mechanism by which HULA affects hypertension management? I'm not convinced it's entirely the physical activity component. I think there's other factors here, social and cultural, that may be actually having larger effects on the outcomes we're seeing. So right now, we're actually conducting a 5-year definitive study. We're funded through the Native Prevention Mechanism to look at this issue with Native Hawaiians. And you can see our aims up there. We expanded our interventions. What we did see when looking at the 6-month data in our pilot study was there was a return to baseline once the HULA was over with blood pressure at 6 months. So those folks who had benefited, their blood pressure started to increase over time. So what we did was we added an additional 3-month maintenance piece, a culturally based maintenance piece, to the 3-month initial HULA intervention to enhance it using self-regulation theory to help guide us in that approach, as well as some cultural practices and values that are integrated with that approach. So we're currently conducting that. We're just finishing up. We actually finished our recruitment. We're finishing up our last group. We should be able to look at some data analyses in the next month or so. So far, we think it's having a similar effect to our pilot study. We're also looking this time at 10-year cardiovascular disease risk, if there's a reduction in the disease risk also because of their participation. And aim 3 is the mechanistic aim. We're looking with structural equation modeling, looking at the mediating effects of various psychosocial and cultural factors to include racism, Hawaiian identity, social functioning, social supports in very specific ways to see if we can better understand how we're getting the effects that we're seeing. And I just wanted to end by sharing with you we have permission, by the way, to share these pictures of people who are participating across Hawaii. Actually, we have it on 3 major islands, 3 of the 5 major islands. We have sites on, and these are some of our participants who are, and by the way, we have excellent recruitment and retention. I think people leave simply because maybe they become hapai or pregnant and no longer can participate. But other than that, we have great retention rates. I just want to mahalo or thank our funders who have funded our projects, but also to thank all of you for your time this morning, afternoon, depending where you're at, as well as the Native Chart faculty and staff. So I guess I'll end at this point and take questions.
Thank you so much. That was a really great and very interesting presentation. So we have one question here I want to read, and it said, Kiave, in the Hermosura 2018 study or in your subsequent planning, have you considered including a comparator such as racism neutral, positive stress control, either social, for example, what does it say? Or I'm sorry, I don't have my glasses on. Maybe you should read it.
Well, I lost where I lost the part where, I'm seeing, I got it back.
You have the chat question? Okay, that's good.
Let me see if I can, questions and answers. It's not, no, I'm not seeing it, I'm sorry.
Okay.
But I think I'll have an idea of what they're asking. We actually did have a third, I'm sorry, I failed to mention, we actually had a neutral stimuli in that. So we actually had 3 conditions. A neutral, where we felt was a neutral interaction between two different Native Hawaiian and a non-Hawaiian, as well as the subtle and blatant. So I think that addresses one of the questions. So we did have a neutral condition. And I didn't get the latter part about the physiological piece.
Let's see, we'll have to bring that back up. But right now we have a question.
Could I ask
Yeah.
the part that was missing?
Yeah.
Hi, Kiave, Jason.
Hey, Jason.
So that was my question, and in addition to your 2 scenario that you presented, either having a stressor like the Trier or a physiologic one like cold pressor as sort of racism neutral positive controls. and it would let you calibrate responses to other literatures and other groups. And then the second piece of that was, in addition to the sort of simple heart rate, blood pressure, did you collect or consider collecting acute stress outcome biomarkers like, ACTH, IL-6, or heart rate variability that you might have gotten from, digital ECG recordings?
Yeah. No, good questions. And, that was a dissertation study with really no funding for Andrea. And I've been encouraging Andrea to continue this study, actually continue recruitment. So they're all good questions. It has been considered. It really was between a study that she could do without funding that was manageable, that would satisfy her dissertation requirements. But it was the first of its kind with Native Hawaiians. As you know, it has been done with African Americans and other groups in different ways. So I think there was all good suggestions to do a more rigorous study with more rigorous stressors to test against, to ensure that what we're seeing is really unique to these racial stressors. But yes, it's been considered, and I would hope in the future we can do this with some NIH funding. So Andrea right now is very much interested in implicit bias and its effects on healthcare outcomes. She's currently doing projects with our Queen's Health Systems, but I am hoping she will revisit this experimental study and continue on in different ways. So I'll hold it for that, Jason.
Okay, we'll just invite anyone else who has a question to raise your hand so that we can unmute you at this time. So go ahead, Jason.
So I feel guilty, maybe monopolizing you, but it's really such, exciting work that you shared, Keawe. We've discussed before that the effect size of the hula intervention is really quite large, and larger than that for physical activity interventions and hypertension done in other ways in other populations. I guess I share your suspicion even more strongly that it isn't the physical activity that's driving the outcome. And which gets at the same sort of question I asked before, and that is, can you include, or did you think of including, as it were, a neutral physical activity arm that wasn't hula? And I could imagine that retention would be better in hula, but if you could control for physical activity, not by intention to treat, but in those who actually do it, I bet you'd see a really small response by comparison, and that would be mechanistically powerful rather than, sort of trying to tease it out post hoc in factor analyses.
Yeah, no, that's a good suggestion, in having a kind of a third arm where you had a different physical activity that wasn't culturally based, but yet might have some benefit to really tease out. Yeah, no, those are good suggestions. And, doing CBPR, it's, doing a 3-arm trial, and I have done it before with a lifestyle intervention where we had a true control group and then actually 2 different delivery formats, one DVD and face-to-face. It can be quite challenging. That would really give us indication of whether or not it's the physical activity or something else. And, we're going to be able to get some of that from the structure equation modeling, but you are correct. It's somewhat post hoc. It's concurrent. We're collecting data over time from baseline 3-month and 6-month on all these mediators. So, I suspect we'll be able to have make some conclusions with some degree of confidence if it's something other than the physical activity, because we are getting medication information. If there's changes to the medication, we're partnering with the clinical pharmacist. We have a cardiologist, Dr. Todd Sito from Queens, as part of our team. We are doing a more careful job in getting other types of information and factors that may explain away any differences that we see between the intervention and control. But I got your point. Yeah, it's an excellent point to really, really more definitively look at that issue. But Jason, one of the things we did do, and I think was Deidre's suggestion, was to give both the control and the intervention group all of the educational materials for hypertension self-management up front and randomize them out into the different, well, actually randomize them before, but so we were able to control for the educational piece at least a bit.
Yeah, I think that was probably crucial. I just think you have a real, quote, secret sauce, and it would be good to nail that down rather than let it sound more mundane than I think it is.
Let's see what we get. We'll know. Actually, Jason, we're going to contact you soon if you want to join the team, given your expertise in hypertension. And let's talk about it, because we can always continue this study in different ways. I would be really interested in working with other indigenous populations around their dance forms or other practices in a similar fashion, because I do think we have something here, and to better understand the mechanism that's involved. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to encourage folks, again, raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question directly, or use the Q&A chat box function, and you can get your questions answered.
The good news is all 24 people are still on and engaged.
Yay! Well, we have this recorded, so I'm sure more people are going to access that. This was really good and very interesting. Okay, so it looks like there are no further questions. So again, thank you very much, Kiave. We appreciate this really great discussion. We just want to remind folks again to please be looking for our survey that will be coming out in the next 24 hours, and be sure to fill it out so that you can get your opportunity to win the $30 Tango card. And we're always looking for more topics that you are interested in around hypertension and cardiovascular disease. So please send your ideas to me, cynthia.gamble@wsu.edu. And we will see you next time. Oh, we have a Q&A here.
Okay.
Breaking question. Will we be able to access the PowerPoint?
I can send you a copy of my PowerPoint if you want to share it with the attendees.
Okay, so the answer is yes. We will be happy to send that out. And they said thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, everyone. Mahalo.
Okay, thank you.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.